Today we have 3 representatives from Camp Pendleton. The first is Captain Weaver. He won't be speaking today, but he's here, and he's the, let me get the right title, he's the Media Engagement Officer. He's also an Osprey pilot, but he doesn't do that right. He used to be he flies planes, but he's out here, and he's out here helping out. We also have 2 other people who will be speaking. One is Colonel Antikyre. Colonel Antikyre is the commanding officer. Let me get this straight. See, I thought he's the commanding officer of Camp Pendleton, and I'm just a civilian. So I'm just trying to work this out. Colonel Antikyre is he's the commanding officer of the headquarters and support battalion. Did I get it right? This is military. I got to make sure that I'm getting it right, but let me tell you something. Colonel Antikyre is a very impressive person, and he would not say that to you, but I will say that to you. He served all over the world, Latvia, Okinawa. He has done a lot for us as Americans, and we're very pleased and proud to have him here with us to represent the Marines and to represent Camp Pendleton. So we're very grateful that he's here. He's received multiple decorations. You can read it. Look at your flyer. You can see it's a 2-page flyer. The Defense Superior Service Medal, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Meritorious. He's got a lot of merit medals. The guy's done a lot of great things for us. So we're just so grateful. So thank you. And but first of all, we're going to have Faye Jonathan, who's the director of the History and Museum Program for the Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Let me just introduce her right now. She'll be the first one to speak. First serving as the head teacher for the Neglected Delinquent Program in Northern California, she later began her museum career as assistant curator of collections for the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. She continued as an NEA fellow to study American art, interpreting the American Industrial Revolution, then led the school outreach program at the Marine Institute in Dana Point. In 1984, Mrs. Jonathan joined the California African American Museum in Los Angeles as registrar in collections. Ms. Jonathan has held her current position as History and Museum Division Director since 1995. She is responsible for interpretive programming and exhibits at the Santa Margarita Ranch House National Historic Site and the Marine Corps Mechanized Museum, where she has focused on creating compelling educational history experiences for all. And I want to point out that there's a few flyers that she has. She has a Marine Corps Mechanized Museum flyer. You might want to pick that up. It's out on the table out front. And there's Women's Marines on Camp Pendleton, a little magazine that will help you understand about the women in the Marines. So through all her vision and efforts, the Camp Pendleton Archives, the Marine Corps Mechanized Museum, and the Camp Pendleton Veterans Memorial Garden were created and opened to the public. Let's give a warm welcome to Faye Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. Now, I'm going to tell you some history of Camp Pendleton, and hopefully that'll give a good background to you. It is the largest contiguous amphibious Marine Corps base anywhere. It has 125,000 acres, and it includes about 17 miles of coastline. But the base is not the land's first military use. The land's been used by the military for a very long time. Starting back in 1769, 250 years ago, we're celebrating that anniversary as well. Gaspar de Portola was an officer of the Navy and the Army for the country of Spain, and they were coming out to protect their coastline. They were coming out to create a buffer next to Mexico to protect New Spain from invaders. And who were the invaders at that time? Well, up in Canada, you had British who were moving west. Up in Alaska, you had Russians who were moving south. So the King of Spain King Charles III said, hey, we need to protect this. And he sent Gaspar de Portola first to Mexico and then up through California to help do that. His job title was Governor of the Californias. But he was a military man first, and he brought troops, both by ship and on land, to go up looking for Monterey Bay. In 1602, Sebastian Vizcaino had located Monterey Bay and took the description back, and this was by sea, of course, took the description back to Spain, and they were very much interested in securing that harbor, in securing that bay to help protect the land that they had against these other invaders. Their intent was to secure the entire coastline of California, which eventually, mostly they did. Now, as they were moving north, looking for Monterey Bay, they started out in San Diego. Well, they actually started out in Mexico, marched some 300 miles before they got to San Diego, and then they would camp at different places along the way and name those places. They had padres with them. They had Franciscan priests with them. And those Franciscan priests did things like keep the diaries that we can now read that tells us where they went and how they did what they did. And those Franciscan priests also helped to look at their ecumenical watches, as it were, and decide whose saint's day it was. So when they stopped at what is now Camp Pendleton, the saint's day was St. Margaret of Antioch. So they named the river, and they named the land Santa Margarita. They also named some other places along the way. San Onofre. If you look at San Onofre, it's named after Saint Onofrius. And Saint Onofrius was actually an Egyptian. So on Camp Pendleton, we have a place named after an Egyptian. They also had a place called Christianitos, because as they were moving north, there were two babies who were Indian babies who were dying, and the padres asked permission to baptize them. And so with all of their ceremony and so on, the priests baptized those two babies, and that became the first baptism in California, and that's at the north end of the base. They also named Las Flores. Well, it wasn't called Las Flores originally, and I'm sorry, my Spanish is so terrible, I would not try to say the name. It's a huge, long name, but it's something like the roses of the bushes from St. Prodigius and the canyons, or something. And as you can see, they didn't like saying all that either. They referred to it as the flowers, Las Flores. Next door, the soldiers complained, not too real close, right next door. There's a piece of land there that the soldiers camped in. And after the priests had called it Las Flores, they kind of frowned and said, sure, Las Flores. There's fleas here, so we're going to call this Las Pulgas. Now you have in Orange County one of the names that they gave, Trabuco Canyon. Okay, so one of the soldiers lost his blunderbuss, his gun, and what they called them in Spanish was Trabuco. And so now, even though they never found it, it's still called Trabuco Canyon. So going back to different military uses of the land, you have Las Flores, like I told you. And at Las Flores in 1810, we had the independence of Mexico from Spain. So now the land is no longer Spanish. It is now Mexican. Okay. And then we have governorships for Alta California. Alta California was anything above Baja California. Okay? So Alta California, that's where we are now, right? It's Alta California. And so there was a governorship, and that was pretty important. You had a lot of people who had settled in the area. They had ranchos and so on. And to be governor was an important job. So 2 people competed for the governorship. Now, it's not done the way we do it. And back then, there was a governor. His name was Juan Bautista Alvarado. And he was trying to keep his governorship. And Carlos Carrillo was trying to compete for it. Well, they were in such disagreement. Each of them had a cadre of people with them. And they met over at Las Flores at the Estancia. And they tried to have a battle. What ended up was a one-shot battle. Nobody got killed. And at the end of the battle, they negotiated peace. Alvarado stayed governor. And they had a barbecue. Isn't that the California way? So the Mexican-American War did last between 1846 and 1848. And the Santa Margarita Ranch House, some of you are familiar with. It's the main ranch house. Some people referred to it as the commandant's house. It really was the base commander's house or the commanding general's house for a long time. But that house was central to the rancho, still named Rancho Santa Margarita at that time. And that Santa Margarita Ranch House became a headquarters not only for the ranch, but it became a headquarters for food and supplies and a place for the Californios that are fighting here to make those lances that they're carrying. Those lances were extremely important. They didn't use guns as much as the Americanos did, but they had these lances, and they were long, made from laurel, made from ash, and tipped with long metal blades. Very deadly. So Andre Pico was the commanding officer for that group of Californios, and his brother owned the land. There's Rancho Santa Margarita at that time. But his brother was, at that time, the last governor of Mexico, California. So Mexican California was really just Alta California, as I mentioned, and they had to get Pio down to Mexico City. They didn't have enough soldiers. They didn't have enough supplies. They didn't have enough support. So he went down to ask for it. He was refused, but at that time we didn't know that. In the meantime, they're fighting a battle over where the Wild Animal Park is in San Diego County. Hopefully you've been there. It's quite a nice place. But right next to it is a place that is today the San Pascual Battlefield State Park. And you can go there and actually see a sample of one of those lances. It's really kind of a neat thing to see. You'll also see a copy of this painting because it's probably the best depiction we have of that battle. It shows the Americans. Prominent in the painting is Lieutenant Gillespie, who was a Marine, and we have the Californios, who are fighting on behalf of Mexico. And this painting was commissioned by the Marine Corps, along with many other paintings that depict how Marines fared in California in those early days in the 1800s. Now, this is the same place, and when they ended up with this battle, those same Marines and sailors and Army people that you see in the foreground ended up marching up toward LA at the end of this battle. Now, that's an interesting thing about this battle as to who won. If you talk to the Californios, they say, well, we killed most of them. We won. And if you talk to the Americanos, or the Americans, how you say it, they say, well, we won, because when we shot that cannon, they left the field of fire. So we won. And we still have that controversy today. They're still discussing it. The gentleman that you see standing up there lighting the cannon was on duty from President Polk at the time. Gillespie wrote his report, and he did say that he won the day by lighting that cannon. The problem was all of those Americans in the foreground had been marching a very long time. The leather on their shoes was worn down to their feet in some cases. They didn't have food. They didn't have a lot of supply. They had a big problem. Their ammunition was wet, wouldn't fire. It took them 3 times, 4 times to get that cannon lit because it was so wet. It was a hard time for them. So, you know, if you go with what the state park says, we lost that battle, but we won the war. Now you have some important people to refer to in your story. You have Pio Pico, the last governor of Mexican California. He had been governor, well, this would be his second time. The first time was as a provisional governor for a short period, and then this last time, at the end of the Mexican-American War, he was the last one to hold that office. He was interesting because he was born at San Gabriel Mission. He didn't have much of anything when he started. His father was a soldier, a guard, and he worked his way up. He supported his mother and sisters down in San Diego. He tried very hard to be successful. And he ran the Rancho Santa Margarita, had cattle there. In those days, you weren't supposed to deal with, when you were under Mexican government, and even when you were under the Spanish government, it was very discouraged to make dealings with the ships that were all along our shore wanting to trade. They wanted to trade for our hides. So go back to a time, Richard Henry Dana comes to our shores here in California in 1834. And his purpose isn't to collect those hides. They were considered California dollars. And so those hides were extremely important. In a time when hides were important, you had leather hats, leather coats, leather boots, leather saddles. If you look under the stagecoach, the next time you see the Wells Fargo wagon at a museum or at an event, look underneath the vehicle and you'll see the springs that are underneath the vehicle are actually made of leather. Our car springs look a lot the same design, but it was leather back then. Leather was used for everything, all the book covers, everything. You needed leather. And you needed the tallow. Big barrels, not even barrels, they're kettles, giant kettles of tallow was collected from the people who raised cattle in California in those early days. Whether it was mission period or whether it was rancho period, it didn't matter. Those were still big things to provide. And they traded. The big criticism from Richard Henry Dana in his book was, you know, those Californios were strange. You know, they had dirt floors, and they wanted to trade for satin shoes. What is that? You know? But he didn't understand what it was like out here. He didn't understand. But Pio Pico is one of our early people in California. He had a lot to say about what we have, and maybe because of him and maybe 10 other men, we don't speak Russian today. Okay? They were interested, in that group of people who were deciding who to go with. They knew that Mexico was not supporting the way they should. And they knew that that Spain was still kind of interested. They knew that France was interested. They knew America, United States was sending out ships. England was sending out ships. The Russians were sending out ships. Somehow they didn't like the Russians too well. Because Russia had a fort already in the north, Fort Ross, if you've ever been there. I don't know. They didn't seem to care for them in the writings that I've seen. But they were considering England. They were considering United States. They were considering Spain. they were considering courting those countries to take over California. And what we ended up was the United States. Even though they fought them, they still liked the United States, a lot of the people in that group. They liked the fact that we had written our own Declaration of Independence. That really excited them a great deal. Then you have his brother-in-law in the middle, Don Juan Forester. Now, he came to this country when he was 17 years old. He was, I think, the youngest of 7 brothers in England. And they sent him out here to work for his uncle, who was a ship's captain. He learned how to be a ship's captain. And he ended up working in San Pedro up in LA. He ran that harbor. That was his job. But he was trying to figure out, how I see all these people who are getting land grants. How do I get that? How do I get on that gravy boat? Okay? So he learns that he has to become a Catholic, because it's now Mexico. You have to become a Catholic. You have to become a Mexican citizen. And so he marries Pio Pico's sister, Isadora. He marries her, so he's now got some in with the families here. And he becomes a Mexican citizen, he becomes Catholic, and he becomes very, very successful. By the end of his life, he is in who's who in California. His brother-in-law is not. Really kind of interesting how that all worked out. At any rate, Don Juan Forester ended up taking over the rancho. I kind of mentioned that earlier. He took over the Rancho Santa Margarita, but he ended up owning, almost, I would say, about 1/5 of California at one point. He owned a lot. But his beginning, he and his wife had moved into what the old Mission gift shop before they transformed it. The old Mission gift shop, that's where their house was. That's where they lived. And they had several sons, and they moved from there when he bought the Rancho Santa Margarita. And it's interesting because President Lincoln then signed a document. He signed a law that said that land, that those missions were going to go back to the Catholic Church. But the lands, so he had to move out anyway, eventually. It just happened the timing was right. And he expanded what is now the Rancho Santa Margarita Ranch House into a much larger building than it started out with Pio in his 2 rooms. Marcos Forester on the far right of the panel is the son of Don Juan Forester, and he was also in the who's who. He was well regarded. He moved to an area of the Rancho Santa Margarita where all the rodeos were taking place. Now, the purpose of the rodeo in those early days was because before 1870 in California, you had free-range cattle. That means the cattle could wander wherever they wanted to eat. You would let them go into the fields, get fat, get happy, okay? So free-range cattle was the thing, and how you managed at the end of the season, you would go to Las Flores. That was probably the largest rodeo ground, and everybody, so I might have cattle there. Pio had cattle there. Other people had cattle that they would let them have their cattle be on that land. And the way to get your cattle back was during that rodeo. You would find the babies were following their mamas, and you knew that those were the babies that belonged to that mama's brand, whatever brand she had on. That was the brand that was going to go on to the calves. And that was the way you figured out how much you had in the way of cattle. That was the purpose of rodeos, was to separate the cattle and to get together. It was a social event, but that was what was done at Las Flores. So Marcos Forester had his house built there when he got married. He'd been married for a little while, but he made this house for his bride. It is now on the National Register as a National Historic Landmark. In this painting, it is an 1877 painting by James Walker. It's owned by the California Historical Society. And it's called Cowboys Capturing a Bear. Now, there's more to this painting, because in this painting, you see on a white horse, naturally, Don Juan Forester, and he is helping with this event. It was a common activity. Now, remember, these people did not have computers. They did not have games that you play. They had games that they played, and one of the games that they played was betting. And one of the things they bet on is whether that bear would mangle the bull that they would put into the ring with him. Take bets on which one would win. But this was a regular event. Now, Forrester paid Pio Pico's debt. Now, his debt was a betting debt. He gambled that his horse was faster than Don Sepulveda's. When you hear the word Don, it's kind of, think back to Old England and think to word sir. Okay, if you were knighted, you were a sir. In Mexican and Spanish California, if you were a Don, you were a landed person. You had a lot of land. You were important. You were recognized, and your title was Don. So he paid off Don Pio Pico's gambling debt, but Don Sepulveda had a little filly he'd brought from Spain, and she was very fast. And Pio Pico's big California horse, who always won the races, didn't win the race this time. So Pio lost to that bet. He lost the Rancho Santa Margarita. He lost the horses and the cattle he had. His brother-in-law says, I'll pay your debt, just give me the land. So that's how he bought the Rancho Santa Margarita. He paid off that debt. He moved on to the land in 1864, but there was a lawsuit. Now, that sounds nasty, and it probably was, but for us, it's a benefit. Why is it a benefit? Because court documents tell us a lot about what the land was like. It tells us about what buildings were where. It tells us about the people. So we have the court decision in 1873 that actually gave the land to Don Juan Forester, but what we do have is a lot of history from those court documents. This is the land that you may or may not be familiar with as you drive by on I-5 and you say, oh, wow, there's all that open land. Okay, well, this is the same kind of image you would have seen had you gone through during the mission period. Big open land, used for cattle back in that day, too. During the Rancho periods. During the Civil War period, this is what the Union soldiers saw when they went out to do maneuvers on our, what we call Red Beach today. This is the same land that the O'Neills took up a picnic in 1908. They got all dressed up, dressed to the nines, to go out on the point, and I think it's a rest stop now, but back then it was open out to the point over the ocean, and they went out there for a picnic. And why did they go there? Well, because the news was that Teddy Roosevelt was sending his great white fleet out along our coastline. It was passing by. And I guess the Great White Fleet knew who they were too, because as the ships passed around that point, the band struck up and started to play. And that was a big deal. So that was what they saw. What we saw in 1939 is a cattle ranch. The people that took over the ranch when Don Juan Forester died were the O'Neills and the Floods. You have the two gentlemen and a little child in a cart. Those two gentlemen are the ones who own the rancho. The man standing up was Flood. James Flood got his money from the silver mines in Nevada. He was known as the Comstock Lode, one of the Comstock Lode kings. there were about 4 of them that figured out that there was a mine, a silver mine, that had run its course. Everybody said it was a dead mine. There was nothing else to get out of it. And it became the largest silver strike anywhere in the United States, ever. Still stands today, I believe. He took his money and he became, later, started the Crocker Bank, which I don't think exists anymore, does it? I don't remember. At any rate, he owned things. He went together into business with O'Neill. Now, back in that day, he ran a bar. It was called the Auction Lunch in near Market Street in San Francisco. And down the street from him was his friend O'Neill, who was a butcher. Now, they both were Irishmen, so if you tell a story about an Irishman going into a bar, these are the Irishmen, okay? And they came from Chicago. Now, whether they knew each other in Chicago, or they met along the way, or whether they met in San Francisco, we don't know. We know that they came out because of the gold rush. We knew that they could make money at that time with a bar, yeah. And that the butcher knew he could make money because they always, the tradition at that time, and it's interesting, I thought maybe it was just here, but I found documents that show advertisements for the East Coast. If you went to a bar, you got a lunch, you got a sandwich. You know, like you get peanuts today. Back then, it was a sandwich. Don't you feel jilted? They got a sandwich, and so they had to have good meat. And O'Neill provided Flood with the meat. They became good business partners in that adventure. They did other things later on together, so they knew each other very well. The bar is where Flood heard about the news that Forrester had passed away and that the land was up for sale by the family. And so he started talking to O'Neill about it, and he knew that O'Neill had run a ranch before. They'd gone into business doing that, smaller places. And they said, well, you want to try that? That's a pretty big place. I think it was 133,000 acres at that time. You want to do that? And they got in together. They had a handshake agreement between the Floods and the O'Neills that said, after 20 years, if we made such a good go of it, we would split the land between us. After these 2 gentlemen passed away, the families honored that handshake agreement. Now, they purchased the land in 1882. The man you see in the middle is Richard O'Neill Sr., the first Richard O'Neill. There were, I think, 3 by the time we got done, but Richard O'Neill Sr. and his wife were the ones that ran the ranch. And Sing Young was the cook. Sing Young is another interesting story. He was a man from China. He came here when he was 18. He worked at Las Flores first, and then he spent 40 years working as the head cook, the cook, at the Rancho Santa Margarita. He cooked for everybody. He would go back home every 5 years to take back. So, you know, in those days, they made huge flour sacks that you could buy at the market. He would get those flour sacks delivered, and they would, of course, he had to make food for all the cowboys and the family, so he needed a lot of flour sacks. And he would save those flour sacks. If you worked over there, you did not touch Sing Young's flour sacks. They were printed pretty. That was a thing that they used to market the flour. And if you saved your flour sacks, you had enough fabric to make all kinds of clothes. So that was the purpose. So he saved all those, and he saved his pay. I mean, he was living on the rancho, and he had food, and he had shelter, so he didn't have many expenses except to go back to China every 5 years and come back again. He would go to visit his family. He'd take his flour sacks and his pay and give it to his wife and children. He did that until the Boxer Rebellion occurred in China, and he found that his wife and children were dead. He ended up having to remarry, and I believe he had more children, and one of them, I think, I'm told, it could be not a true thing, but I understand that he had a son that became a lawyer in San Francisco. But he did that work for 40 years, and he returned to China in 1919. This is the ranch road that you would have seen. You see there's a railroad track down the middle of it, and you see there's sort of cliffs to the right of it. And this is the way it appeared way back when. Now, it says construction here, 1942, and that's because in 1941 December, you all know that we had a bombing at Pearl Harbor. And so the Department of Defense, Secretary of the Navy, scrambled to try to figure out what we're going to do next. How are we going to prepare Marines to send them over to the Pacific War? What are we going to do? So they started, they actually got an evaluation of the property. They had been looking at this property for some time. In 1939, actually, they had an evaluation of the property made. And the Army looked at it, thought, well, maybe we'll train tankers. No, maybe not. And it went on. But then when war broke out, that's when the Navy went ahead and claimed the land under the War Powers Act of the time and enacted it after that bombing. Condemnation proceedings went ahead in 1942, but it was by the end of 1943 that the largest check that ever passed through a San Diego bank at that time for $4.25 million went to the families who owned the Rancho Santa Margarita, and this became their property. What you see in this picture is the beginning of construction, early 1942, after the condemnation was started. They knew that they needed the land. The War Powers Act gave them the right to take the land and use it for war purposes. And they needed a road. So what you see is a 4-lane highway. Now this is early on, you can tell by the cars, but when you go there now, it doesn't look that much different, except the railroad's not there anymore. But there's a 4-lane highway, and that cliff is still there. President Roosevelt came to the ranch house. This is him at the ranch house. And he's talking to Pancho Brown. Pancho Brown is showing him a lariat. Now, the lariat is a really important tool for a vaquero or cowboy. It's how they do all the roping and everything that they do with cows. Roosevelt was very impressed with the ranch house and the history associated with it. The other two men in the picture, to the far left, you have General Vogel, who is in charge, commanding the whole San Diego region. And you have the 29th governor of California, Culbert Olson, next to him. But as he toured the ranch house, he decided that it should be preserved, that it should be kept to tell the story of the rancho and what it was like to anybody who visited in the future. By 1943, we got our first women on Camp Pendleton. These were called Women Marine Reserves. They called them MWRs for short. Everything's an abbreviation. There were 95 of them that first came in October of 1943. They were quite a jolt to the Marine Corps. Marine Corps had not had women before that time that they were used to. And these were women that had drilled. You can see they're marching in formation outside the ranch house where they had just gotten a tour. They were quite something, but they had joined up because there were big posters everywhere, said, "Free a Marine to fight." Each of these women felt that they were replacing a Marine that had to do the administrative, repair, different kinds of other jobs that they had. They were doing radio work. They were doing repairs on the vehicles, flying vehicles if they needed to. These were all jobs that they could replace a man and allow him to go overseas in the Pacific War. They lived in an area near the ranch house, and at that time, the ranch house was called Camp Pico. Their cantonments. They named each of the cantonments on the base. So this was the Camp Pico portion of Camp Pendleton. And in that early day, by the way, Camp Pendleton was Marine Barracks Camp Pendleton. We were a subsidiary to what is now MCRD, Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. Another set of pioneers were our Navajo code talkers. I just learned that they actually created the Navajo code on Camp Pendleton. I knew they were on Camp Pendleton. I thought they were there to train, but I didn't know they actually developed the code there. And what they did is they used the Navajo language, which hardly anybody knew except Navajo. And the Navajo had been suppressed in the use of their language, so it was kind of upsetting to them. They were being told to do something they'd had their hands slapped for so many years, to come out and work with that language and figure out a code that could be used by the Marines and the Navy and anybody else who was out there. They could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line message in English in 20 seconds. Before that time, it took them 30 minutes by machine. You can imagine how that expedited their efforts during the Pacific War. These Navajos served in all of the different battles of the Pacific War. And their code was so important, it was kept secret until not too awfully long ago when the president finally made it okay to know and awarded the Navajo code talkers for their services. We have a road on Camp Pendleton called Basilone Road, and it's named after one of our Marines in the World War II. He first got a Medal of Honor for serving on Guadalcanal. We have several roads and places commemoratively named on the base after several of the people who got Medals of Honor from Guadalcanal. But he came back. He was paraded around the country to raise money for the war bonds. He was on all the war bonds drive. He was the poster child, if you will. And, you know, here is this warrior, this hero, etc. And he got very tired of that, didn't like doing that, wanted to go back with his troops. So here he is back on Camp Pendleton, getting ready to deploy to the Pacific War. He goes to Iwo Jima. Oh, before he leaves, he gets married to a female Marine, one of those WRs, and he marries her. Within a couple of months, he's off to Iwo Jima. That's the last she sees of him because he is killed on Iwo Jima. And she receives a Navy Cross for him posthumously. In 1946, we have a new group of military police who are given motorcycles, and you can see something interesting on the top of their motorcycle. You see that it says military police, and then it has an emblem. What is that emblem? Well, it's the brand off of the cattle that O'Neill got out of Texas after the drought. There was a huge drought in the area. All the cattle had died way back. We're talking back in time. And O'Neill had gone to Texas and got cattle, and so that became the brand of the Rancho Santa Margarita de las Flores. When the Marines took over the rancho, they did everything they could to preserve that history, and one of the things they did is they adopted that brand. So here you've got our motorcycles branded with that brand. People ask me what the TO brand stands for. Well, we don't rightly know. We know it was used and branded in Texas. We know that the cattle came with it. We believe it means Texas and Oklahoma because of the location of the rancho where it had been used, but we don't know that for sure. So that's still a thing that any one of you, if you're a research type person, can help and find. We would love to know that. But I would like to draw your attention to the patches on the left arm of the Marines there. Each of those patches is a different patch, and those patches designate what unit that Marine is from. And the one closest to you there has a diamond-shaped patch with a 1 on it and some stars. He was part of the 1st Marine Division. Marines no longer wear those unit patches, but they still have insignia that they refer to. We also had some 20 movies made on Camp Pendleton, either partially or completely. Here we have John Wayne standing on the reviewing stand with commanding officers, and they're reviewing troops. He was honored because the film had just come out in 1949, December, and it was the Sands of Iwo Jima, and that film was very much made on Camp Pendleton. It might distress you to know that our Marines crawled up beaches on Camp Pendleton that were made to look like Iwo Jima. Now realize Iwo Jima is known for its volcanic ash, volcanic rock on its beaches. So the filmmakers, in their wisdom, spread the beaches with asbestos. And we have pictures of fake palm trees on the beaches of Camp Pendleton. But this was all part of, next time you see the film, check it out. But that is the setting for Sands of Iwo Jima, was the beaches of Camp Pendleton. You also have a film more recently made. In 1986, we came out with a Korean War film called Heartbreak Ridge, and it was made at Camp Talaga, a northernmost camp on Camp Pendleton. And Clint Eastwood was the director.
Among the Korean War veterans returning to Camp Pendleton was a 4-legged chestnut Maine beauty known as Sergeant Reckless. Purchased by Marines at the Korean racetrack, she was enlisted to carry ammo for the recoilless rifle through heavy enemy fire and was decorated for valor. At the end of the war, she was sent to Camp Pendleton, where she was promoted to staff sergeant and officially retired by the commandant of the Marine Corps. She gave birth to 2 offspring named Fearless and Dauntless, and the 3 became mascots for the 5th Marine Regiment.
Now, she's buried on Camp Pendleton. Recently, some of you may have attended a dedication of a statue to Reckless. She had been wounded twice in Korea. She was very smart. She was a racehorse. She was actually a pedigreed racehorse, purchased in Korea, purchased in Seoul, from a young boy who took care of her at that racetrack in Seoul. And he needed the money because his sister had lost her hand during the Korean War and wanted to get a prosthetic for her. And so they paid him the money and got Reckless and trained her. She could step over barbed wire. She could make her way from the camp with the ammunition on her back for the recoilless rifle that was out in the field. So she would go from the camp to the gunner, and he would offload the ammunition, and then she would go back. She was very much exposed, and I guess the enemy must have figured out what she was doing because they shot at her at least twice. The interesting thing about Reckless is that she managed to stay with the group until the end of the Korean War. And when she was shipped back to the United States, they wanted to have her here. They didn't want her in Korea. I mean, they bought her, right? So when they landed in San Francisco, it was the Marine Corps birthday. And I don't know if you know Marines, but Marines always celebrate their Marine Corps birthday. And they were at the Marine, there's a hotel in San Francisco, the Marine Memorial. And in that hotel, it's a few stories high. In the top story, there is a ballroom. They put her in the elevator, took her up to the ballroom. She ate some of the flowers on the tables, and she ate some birthday cake and had beer with the Marines. This is the old front gate, probably in the 1950s, 1960s. This is what you would have seen for our main gate. If you've come by the main gate recently, you'll see that it's no longer like that. But back then, that was a very important main gate. In 1975 was the fall of Saigon. Camp Pendleton got its orders from the president's office. Get ready, you're going to get 18,000 people tomorrow. Get your Marines ready, get them to fix up the buildings and whatever you can, tents, whatever, to put up 18,000 people. And they came. They came by way of El Toro. They came by aircraft and ended up being bused down to Camp Pendleton. There were Red Cross people. There were INS was there to process them. They had to pass all kinds of security, health checks, everything you can imagine. But the Marine Corps was asked to provide housing, food, clothing. These people came with what was on their backs. They had nothing. Some people came by way of Guam. They were boat people. Some people, they came all different ways. You'll hear lots and lots of stories about how they came to this country. But Camp Pendleton was their first home on this continent. There were 3 other camps around the United States that developed right afterwards, but this was the first one. In some cases, some of the people at Camp Pendleton ended up at some of those other camps. By the end of those 8-10 months, that in 1975, 50,000 Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees had passed through Camp Pendleton. They went to many people in the communities who took them in, became their sponsors, helped them to get jobs, helped them to find places to live. On Camp Pendleton, many of them learned English for the first time. Some of them still work at Camp Pendleton. Some of them went away and came back to Camp Pendleton and are now federal employees. It's a really interesting collection of stories. If any of you are interested in the archives, I have wonderful documents and oral histories that can share with you. This map of Camp Pendleton, if you look at it, the northernmost part is Camp Talega. And I talked to you about Camp Talega already, but this is where the refugee camps were. There were 8 camps. They were, some of them all tents, some of them were Quonsets, but they were housing for these people. You see along the coast southward, you see the Las Flores Adobe National Historic Landmark. There is also the Las Flores Estancia National Historic Landmark and several other interesting places there. Down further south, you see the marking for the Santa Margarita Ranch House National Historic Site, the famous ranch house. On the ranch house property are 3 buildings. One is the ranch house, another is the ranch house chapel, and the other is the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse would be where the cowboys had slept, and it's now a little museum, actually helped open by President Roosevelt's son, Colonel Roosevelt, helped to dedicate it. The chapel's interesting because if you think about it, this was in Camp Pico, and the women Marines were very upset because they were having to pray at that 1943 time period, having to pray in the brig. Now, I guess because it was a new base, we didn't have very many people in the brig yet, so they used it for a place to pray. The Ranch House Chapel was a blacksmith shop when the Marines marched aboard base. And they decided to renovate it and have it fit that mission period design. It is an adobe building. It is part of the National Historic Site. It was dedicated by the women Marines when they got there. But it became so popular, it was the first real chapel on the base, that it became the first chapel for everybody. A lot of weddings, funerals took place there, a lot of baptisms. And so when we had the 1993 flood, these people all came forward and said, hey, just because the flood washed out 2 whole walls of your building doesn't mean you got to tear it down. And so it was renovated. And today you can still go to services there on Sunday at 10 o'clock. It is an important part of our tour of the ranch house property. Inside, we have one window that's a replacement. This window cost us, well, it cost the volunteers, the docents, $6,000 that they had raised to replace a window that back in 1940s cost about $250. It's very similar to the original window, not exactly like the original window because it is not the same window, but they were both about St. George. Now this is the Las Flores property in 2000. It was deteriorating. Nobody was living in it. Ranch house, there were generals who were living in that house. We've had both base commanders and Marine Expeditionary Force commanders living in the ranch house. And some of them went on to become commandants of the Marine Corps. But in this house, in the Las Flores adobe, we didn't have that benefit. No one was living in the house. After the last person died in 1968, they didn't know what to do with it. And it's kind of far out there. It's north on the base or mid-base, and so there was nobody to put in the house. So it deteriorated, and the bottom left picture shows a wooden side to the building. It's a 2-story side, and it had bees inside the wall. And as you can see, the walls are deteriorating. Later, we ended up getting a University of Vermont, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. That house is known as the McGee House to a lot of people. And you have Victoria and Henry McGee, which were some of the first residents of the house. Most famously, I don't have her picture here, but most famously we have Jane McGee. Jane McGee became known as the lima bean queen. She raised lima beans on that property. Especially during World War II, her family complained, all we get from you are bags of lima beans. So the interesting fellow down on the left is Clifford May. Clifford May became known for his designs of ranch-style houses designed after the Las Flores house, where he spent his summers and weekends growing up. That greatly influenced his designs of homes, and people still collect his homes today. This is Las Flores after the University of Vermont had done restoration. They took every one of those wood boards that you saw and numbered them, took them off, figured out which ones had too much bee on them and which ones could be cleaned and which ones had to be replaced, and put them back. And so this is what you see in that picture is just after their restoration. They also replaced the roof. They also did earthquake retrofit to the building and put back that veranda that you see. From that veranda, in the early days, you could see, the family could see the stagecoach coming from San Diego on its way up to LA. That was a stagecoach stop. Later, it became a train stop. It was also one of the first places in California to have telegraph, but the telegraph was limited only to certain people that were connected to that ranch. We also have on Camp Pendleton a large collection, the largest collection of Marine Corps vehicles anywhere. It has vehicles that tell us the story of the Marine Corps equipment from 1942 to the present. And this particular photo shows you a parade of those vehicles in Oceanside for a 4th of July parade. I have taken you through time. I have shown you the many uses of Camp Pendleton land, from Gaspar de Portola through the one-shot Battle of Las Flores, through the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, World War II, and how the Marine Corps began in 1942. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, tremendous privilege and honor for me to be here today. Appreciate the introductions and really the chance to come and speak with you and share the story of Camp Pendleton. Again, a quick introduction. Colonel Phil Antikyre, currently stationed at Camp Pendleton for the last 8 months. I'm serving as commanding officer of Headquarters and Support Battalion, which is kind of a whole story in itself. What I'd like to do is follow up the work that Faye did as far as giving you the background of Camp Pendleton and provide a look at where we're at today. And to do that, we'll have to set the stage with the Marine Corps. As we were preparing kind of remarks, I realized it was a little bit challenging because we have so many of you here with a lot of background and knowledge on Camp Pendleton. So I apologize in advance if I hit the Marine Corps basics or 101 as we go through, that it's repetitive for you. But I think the takeaway is there's going to be something that is new to all of us. Just again, as an introduction, I started here in Southern California with the Marine Corps as a recruit at boot camp in 1987. So I've had the honor of serving at Camp Pendleton previously, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, and Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego. So I've done a lot of time in Southern California, but this is somewhat of a refresher for me as well because I've been gone for 15 years, overseas, East Coast with the family, different Marine Corps duty stations, and then as of last summer, we were able to return. So I am a current resident of Camp Pendleton. My wife and 3 daughters, we live in the San Luis Rey housing area and really enjoying the time with the Marine Corps. I hope you don't actually read through, but I think as far as my biography, I'll kind of summarize what I've been able to do and why I'm still in the Marine Corps. I've been very fortunate to come and have so many different opportunities and chances to travel that I've stayed in the Marine Corps. Started off as an enlisted Marine and initially was sent to Panama, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get out and go to school, and the Marine Corps kept offering me additional opportunities. So over time, every year that I was going to get out of the Marine Corps, they came back and said, well, how about this? And they would send me to school, or they'd give me another chance to go overseas. And then once I was married and had children, the opportunities were so great that we just stayed in. So I've been really blessed by what the Marine Corps has been able to provide for myself and my family, and very proud to continue to serve. And then one thing I wanted to say before I start as well is coming back to California and the chance to speak before all of you. But we also are very engaged down in Oceanside Chamber of Commerce with different Veterans Association in North County, a lot of different groups that will come out and we'll speak with. And what I've been really impressed over the last year is just the community support and engagement that we have from off-base to on-base. And that means so much to the Marines and families at Camp Pendleton. There's a lot of different services, and we'll see some of that in the brief, and I'll talk through it. But again, before I start, I just wanted to give a sincere thank you to all of you for support in so many different ways for the Marines and sailors of Camp Pendleton. So what I have teed up right now and with Captain Weaver and the team and Faye is we have a couple videos that will give you an overview of Camp Pendleton as well as Marine Corps Installations West and Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton. A few minutes of that, and then I've got to walk through the Marine Corps, what we're doing and what we're doing at Camp Pendleton. But I'd like to leave time at the end, and this I hope will be helpful, is to have questions from all of you for Faye and myself, and we'll do our best to answer. The takeaway or the hope today is that as you drive up and down I-5 and you see Camp Pendleton and you have questions about what are they doing there, who works there, what's the mission, we can provide answers to that, or anything else, we'll do our best. Oof, wow. We'll quickly move past that picture. When you assume command, so I'm a commanding officer, and you have to go to the Office of Communications to the base photographer and get a picture taken so you can put it up on the wall and scare people. That was the one from last summer. And Marines that I work with commented that you look so mean, and I tell them, well, I was actually smiling on the inside. So, but it's very painful to see that.
In order to train as we fight, Marines must have access to interconnected land, sea, and air ranges. The varied terrain and climate of the Southwest makes the region an ideal place for Marines to train for current and future operations. The Marine Corps maintains 7 installations within California and Arizona. 80% of the Marine Corps' real estate and 40% of its combat power resides in the Southwest region. More than 90% of the Marines train in the Southwest region before deploying overseas. The Marine Corps reorganized regional commands to increase efficiencies. Marine Corps Installations West consists of 5 installations and 2 training ranges, and serves in direct support to Marine Corps Recruiting Command San Diego and Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center 29 Palms. Marine Corps installations are the foundation of the supporting establishment that constitutes the 5th element of the Marine Air Ground Task Force. Irreplaceable national assets, installations are fundamental to the combat readiness of Marine operating forces and integral to the quality of life of Marines, sailors, and their families.
Hands come to your chest, push up, front foot.
As residents of the local community, Marines are committed to preserving Arizona and Southern California's natural resources. Responsible stewards of the environment, Marine leaders properly balance the operational needs of the Marine Corps and the preservation of the environment for future generations.
Okay, and so that's starting big picture with Marine Corps Installations West. And bottom line, this is not just Camp Pendleton, but it covers everything on the western United States with 29 Palms, Yuma, Arizona, Marine Corps Air Station, Miramar. So that's a big picture. The next video will take us down to Camp Pendleton and give you a snapshot. Whoop, wrong way. Oof. I hope that's not embedded throughout. That'll be... That's right, but it'll keep people awake.
Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton was established in 1942 and continues to serve as the Marine Corps' primary and premier amphibious training base. In 2011, the base was redesignated as Marine Corps Installations West Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. As a result, a brigadier general serves as the commanding general for the region and the base. Home to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and the School of Infantry, Camp Pendleton is one of the busiest installations in the Department of Defense. With more than 125,000 acres and 17 miles of shoreline, Camp Pendleton provides critical training platforms for more than 40,000 Marines and sailors preparing to deploy overseas. The vast terrain and close proximity to land and coastal training ranges provides Marines the opportunity to incorporate combined arms training by using naval assets with fixed and rotary wings aircraft in direct support of ground and extensive convoy operations. With a daily population averaging 70,000, Camp Pendleton is a multifaceted base that offers training opportunities, facilities, services, and support responsive to the needs of Marines and their families. As residents of Southern California, Camp Pendleton opens its gates to neighbors throughout the year. The world-famous Mud Run is one of the many events that unite the surrounding community with our Marine Corps family. Through partnerships with local organizations and regulated programs, Camp Pendleton remains a leader in energy conservation and a dedicated steward of the environment. The home to 17 threatened or endangered species, Camp Pendleton is committed to the protection and preservation of its natural and cultural resources. Camp Pendleton remains one of the largest economic contributors to the local economy, spending close to $148 million annually in employee salaries. With allocated dollars for energy projects, construction projects, child care facilities, and new housing, Camp Pendleton is a reliable source of income for many Southern California residents.
Okay, so there's Camp Pendleton at large. One more video, and this is going to cover the Marine Corps Air Station at Camp Pendleton. And again, if you haven't been on Camp Pendleton lately or ever, I was impressed coming back as far as the scale and scope of the air station there, and you'll see just the capabilities. Again, a few miles inland, so you won't see it from I-5, but here's a quick snapshot.
Originally established in 1942, Camp Pendleton's air facility was redesignated as Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton in 1985 and commemoratively named Munn Field in 1987. Currently, it serves as the rotary wing hub for Marine Aircraft Group 39. Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton is home to 5,000 Marines serving in 11 active squadrons. Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton supports operations for the AH-1 Zulu Viper, the UH-1 Yankee Venom, and the MV-22 Osprey. The Marine Corps' largest aviation logistics squadron also operates on the installation. In addition, over 250 civilian employees work at the air station and contribute to the economic welfare of the region. Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton operates as a secure airfield, maintaining air station facilities, equipment, and properties in support of operational forces preparing for combat. Strategically located within 2 miles of the California coast and within close proximity to ground forces, Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton provides access to numerous training ranges and serves as a premier aviation hub for combined arms training. The location of Marine Corps Air Station Camp Pendleton is critical to shipboard training and amphibious operations along the coast. Without the Air Station Naval Expeditionary Ship-to-Shore training, operations will be gravely impacted.
Okay, great videos to kind of set the stage. And I'm going to walk through and kind of cover some of the statistics and additional background from big to large. So when we're looking at the mission of defense, Department of Defense, I really want to lay the groundwork for you to understand what the Marine Corps hopes to achieve and why we're so eager to continue to operate here in Southern California. So I'm going to start with a general overview and explain things from the national level, give you a better idea of the goals and challenges for Camp Pendleton. So I think everyone's tracking the Marine Corps is one of 5 armed forces, armed services in the United States, along with the Navy, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard. And of the 4 services that completely fall under the DoD, the Marine Corps is the smallest. And ultimately, our mission and function is determined by the larger goals of the Department of Defense. The strategy and goals of the DoD are periodically explained and communicated through a document called the National Defense Strategy. Per the DoD National Defense Strategy of 2018, the mission of the DoD is to provide combat-credible military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our nation. Should deterrence fail, the joint force is prepared to win. So, the devil's in the details. In national defense, as in all things, and simply stating that we need to be able to deter threats and win wars, but that's not enough to maintain the United States' dominance in conventional conflict in the next century. So the NDS identifies 3 primary lines of effort, 3 goals for us to make sure we're able to fulfill our basic mission in the defense of our nation. So first, we must build a more lethal force. That means a force, conventional or otherwise, that is capable of defeating all potential strategic competitors in open conflict. This is the most basic, foundational focus of the Department of Defense and the Marine Corps. We win battles. The next initiative is that the Department of Defense is currently undertaking to strengthen our partnerships that make peace and stability across the globe possible. Winning a war is irrelevant if there is no local partner with you to secure that peace. And the final task out of the NDS for us is more internally focused, and in many ways the hardest. Over many years of conventional dominance, a focus on excellence at all costs has begun to make the military unaffordable. Personnel and administrative costs have ballooned, and even the Marine Corps is not immune. We all need to get better at learning to do more with less. Because a capability that you can't afford is that a capability that won't be around for long. So what does this all mean for California? So California has the largest population of active duty military members of any state. Despite trends and efforts to move the military across the nation, based on geography, history, and circumstances, have resulted in California hosting 190,000 service members, and they're scattered across 30 different military bases. Bases like Vandenberg Air Base, Fort Irwin Army Base, Naval Base San Diego, and Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton are major contributors to the economy of California. 1 in 5 jobs in San Diego County alone are related to defense in some way or another. So any major reforms are happening in the Department of Defense are going to have an impact on California, particularly Southern California. So the surest way to prevent a war is to be prepared to win one. And the only way to be sure that you're prepared to win a war is to have the best trained force wielding the best technology in the most efficient way. An example of this is recently on Camp Pendleton, Marines have tested techniques for pairing with autonomous vehicles and new technologies for defeating small unmanned drones without having to use an expensive missile. Places like the White Sands Missile Range have hosted the experimental testing of drones and electronic warfare technology. All the while, students at advanced professional military education programs like the Naval Postgraduate School have been coming up with ways to use these technologies and techniques and integrate them with the larger force at an operational and strategic level. And once the basics of these techniques and technologies have worked out, ground installations like Camp Pendleton will host the large-scale force-on-force exercises necessary to prove that they're effective. So an important part of this validation is the integration with naval ships and aircraft, making installations on the coast vital to improvements in these areas. So just being able to win a battle is not enough. Our alliances are vital to ensuring we're able to get to the battle in the first place. They're also vital to ensuring we have the capability to preserve peace once the battle is done. The two primary tools used to improve military-to-military relationships are joint exercises and joint professional military education. An example of this would be recently the U.S. Marines and the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force participated in a large-scale exercise at Camp Pendleton called Exercise Iron Fist. And the exercise provided training opportunities for the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force for them to build capacity. At the end of the exercise, the Japanese were able to certify their first amphibious brigade since World War II. And this capability will provide a vital capability for our partnership should we ever need to fight together in the Pacific. So in addition to the training exercises, advanced schools like the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey also host Allied service members. This cultural and operational exposure provides important channels of communication when it's necessary to work together with allies years in the future. In 2017, over $34 billion in defense contracts were awarded to over 34,000 defense contractors in California. And the San Diego region is a recipient of over $25 billion in direct defense spending. Camp Pendleton alone contributes over $148 million a year to the local economy just in civilian employee salaries. So over the years, many people in California have come to expect and rely on that money for their livelihoods. That said, the military must be good stewards of the funds that the taxpayers have given them. We have to get more for the money that we spend. As such, the DoD and the Marine Corps are taking steps to streamline and improve the military acquisition process. We need to fail and succeed more rapidly, and we need our civilian workforce to be more capable of adapting. Sometimes this means some discomfort and belt-tightening, but mostly it just means we have to be willing to take more risks and assume more responsibility for success on failure on the part of everyone involved. So where does the Marine Corps fit in? And what is it that we do around here? To understand what the Marine Corps is doing, you need to understand what our enduring role is. So we've been America's expeditionary force in readiness since 1775. Marines are forward deployed to win our nation's battles swiftly and aggressively in times of crisis. We fight on land, air, and sea, and we also provide forces and detachments to naval ships and ground operations. We launched our first amphibious raid as soldiers of the sea in 1776 against Fort Nassau in the Bahamas, and we've gone on to conduct hundreds of amphibious operations in the years since. Just since 1990, the Marine Corps has conducted over 130 amphibious operations, everything from the range of non-combatant evacuations to full amphibious assaults. And right now, today, there's over 3,700 Marines from the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force that are deployed across the globe, both as part of long-term operations and part of amphibious units based off of naval shipping. Okay, so how is the Marine Corps organized? We talk about the rules of three. Starting at the very bottom, 3 Marines and a fire team leader make up a fire team. 3 fire teams and a squad leader make up a squad. 3 squads and headquarters section make a platoon. 3 platoons and a headquarters element make up a company. 3 companies make a battalion. 3 battalions make a regiment. 3 regiments make a division. And the Marine Corps has 3 main active duty divisions and 1 reserve division. An important part of this is the idea of a Marine Air Ground Task Force, a MAGTAF, and you'll hear that term referenced throughout this brief and in the videos. A MAGTAF, a Marine Air Ground Task Force, can be of various sizes depending on the mission it's tasked with, but it's comprised of a command element, the leadership part, and 3 main components. It has an air component, a ground combat element, and a logistics combat element. And together they bring air power, ground fighting forces, and the logistical capacity to sustain both air and ground combat. The largest type of MAGTAF is the Marine Expeditionary Force, or MEF. And 1st MEF is based out of Camp Pendleton. Its air combat element is the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing. The ground combat element is the 1st Marine Division, and the logistics combat element is the 1st Marine Logistics Group. So how is it all changing today? The Marine Corps is not a static organization. In order to meet the Department of Defense and the nation's needs, we need to be constantly modernizing and changing. For example, in March of last year, the Marine Corps hosted the Urban Advanced Naval Technology exercise at Camp Pendleton. There, Marines tested technology to assist with the battle fighting near-peer adversaries in a communication-degraded environment. And this is just one of the massive undertakings to change the way the Marine Corps fights. In September and November of last year, similar exercises were held on the East Coast, focusing on sea control and integration with naval forces. Although building and integrating these technologies is important, ultimately we want to change the way we use individual Marines and their skills. No longer is it enough to stamp out infantrymen in the same mold over and over. And we can't afford to have the unit's best Arabic speaker or computer hacker working at the mess hall. We've developed innovation and initiatives and competitions to tease out the best and brightest and make sure that their skills are being properly used. So who's at Camp Pendleton? We've talked already that Camp Pendleton is the largest Marine Corps installation on the West Coast, with a daytime population of between 65,000 and 80,000. We're home to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, as well as several training commands, such as the School of Infantry. We also have a variety of Navy units that support the operating forces in the region with the necessary services to keep them going. And so why here? We occupy some of the most beautiful beaches in Southern California, along with land worth billions of dollars. And periodically the question will come up, why can't we just move somewhere else? And that's difficult for a number of reasons. The most basic reason is it would be difficult to move Camp Pendleton because the Marine Corps is fundamentally an amphibious organization. Camp Pendleton and the Naval Base in San Diego have served as the gateway to the Pacific for the Marines, Army, and Navy since World War II. Throughout every major operation and still today, Camp Pendleton has served as the premier amphibious training facility for the entire nation. In addition, the base is close to vital ports, airfields, and other military training that facilitates transit and logistics and make it an extremely effective staging area. Finally, we have a proud heritage in the local area. So this is a tough chart to read, but I'll talk to you as far as the range and training capabilities of Camp Pendleton. And don't expect you to be able to read all the details, but each one of those tiny dots represent a training area that the base maintains or manages. We have beaches for amphibious landings, landing zones for helicopters and aircraft, fully functional airfield that you saw with the Marine Corps Air Station, and multiple outlying expeditionary airstrips. The base maintains training areas and ranges for all types of vehicles, from four-wheeled all-terrain vehicles to tanks. There is a large munitions impact area in the center of the base for fixed-wing and helicopter munitions, as well as ground-fired missiles, mortars, and artillery. We even have several mock towns for simulating urban environments, and the scale is simply stunning. What's even more amazing is when you consider that it's only a part of any larger range complex that spans air routes, offshore training ranges, and other massive training bases inland of Camp Pendleton. I think they mentioned in the video, but between Camp Pendleton and 29 Palms, 80% of the Marine Corps forces will transition through our ranges and airspaces before deploying. Okay, a laundry list of services that the base provides. So I won't go through and read all of the details, but it gives you an idea of the scale of services required to support the operations on the base. Effectively, we're our own city with a separate police, fire, and utility to support the tens of thousands of Marines and sailors on base. We support service members and their families off duty with recreational facility and places to purchase basic necessities. Okay, we'll talk briefly on long-term challenges. And by now, hopefully you have a good idea of what Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton does and how it fills a role in supporting the warfire efforts of the nation today. You've seen the history. I'm going to spend the last few minutes before we open up for questions talking about some of our long-term challenges and future initiatives. So the base has had more or less the same borders since 1942. And there are many non-military tenants with noise and training that also impact the local community. So 5,000 of Camp Pendleton's 125,000 acres are set aside for use by non-Department of Defense agencies. And before I get into this, I wanted to make clear that the Marine Corps does not own Camp Pendleton. The people of San Diego County in Southern California don't own the base either. So Camp Pendleton sits on land that's entrusted to the Marine Corps by Congress. And in the end, the legislator has the ultimate authority for what happens in regard to all of these issues. So we as the Marine Corps will do our best work with local partners to resolve any issues and to keep the public informed. This kind of reads like a non-disclosure statement or like a legal, so. Okay, so songs. San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station sits on about 400 acres of Camp Pendleton. Started operating in 1968 and ceased operation in 2013. The plant is owned by Southern California Edison, but sits on a land easement on Camp Pendleton, and the decommissioning process is currently ongoing. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a primary agency with oversight of the decommissioning project. Department of the Navy represents the Marine Corps and our interest during the decommissioning process as the landlord for the easement. Camp Pendleton simply wants to ensure that once the land is eventually returned to the Marine Corps for use, it meets all regulatory requirements so the Marine Corps can safely train on the land without risk to the Marines or to the public. Noise. Okay, I think we've got a video that can explain it better than I can. Let's
We understand the noise produced from our rigorous training is an inconvenience impacting our neighboring communities. Depending on atmospheric conditions, the sound of explosions may be amplified and heard up to 50 miles away. Since 1942, Marines have been training on Camp Pendleton, so they are prepared to fight our nation's battles at a moment's notice. Marines must train in all climes and terrain, day and night, because combat has no perfect conditions. Camp Pendleton's landscape and geography makes it perfect for land, sea, and air training. The base's location in Southern California also puts it close to vital ports, airfields, and metropolitan areas. Marines on Camp Pendleton are an essential part of our community. The base contributes over $148 million to the local economy in civilian salaries, and the military adds over $25 billion to the greater San Diego area in direct defense spending. We do what we can to minimize our impact and keep the public informed. For noise inquiries, visit our website or contact Range Operations Division Office at 760-725-0357.
Okay, that was our last video. Beaches. Comes up a lot on San Onofre State Beach. Has 2,000 acres that were leased out from Camp Pendleton. A 50-year lease was signed by President Nixon in 1971, and that lease expires in year 2021. So discussions are currently ongoing between base leadership and the California State Parks on what the future of the lease will be. And as always, discussions of this type are typically lengthy, and it could be close to the lease expiration date before a final agreement is reached. Environmental security. So less than 20% of Camp Pendleton's land is developed. It stands as an ecological buffer between the heavily urbanized areas that abut to the north and south of the base. Within Camp Pendleton, tidal estuaries, coastal plains, rolling hills, canyons, and mountains provide essential habitats for over 1,100 species of flora and fauna, to include 18 federally listed threatened and endangered species and a free-roaming herd of bison. So, as such, the base has a serious responsibility to maintain and preserve California's precious natural resources. It may not seem like our training is conducive to environmental stewardship, but because much of the base is underdeveloped, water is by and large allowed to flow freely. Many fires are allowed to burn naturally, and local flora and fauna go mostly undisturbed. This leads to a flourishing natural habitat that would be seriously threatened if the land were developed. Our environmental security department works closely to monitor the habitats of base and minimize the impact of our training on the environment. Infrastructure. So, given the size of Camp Pendleton and the number of residents on base, we constantly have to expend effort to maintain the base infrastructure and make sure our residents have the services they need. Interesting to note, we have 24 wells, 7 sewage treatment plants, 375 miles of water lines, 145 miles of gas lines, and 530 miles of road that need to be maintained. And all of our funding to maintain this comes from the federal budget. Much of the infrastructure is aging and in need of significant overhaul and repair. And we continue to do what we're able to do to modernize the infrastructure on base. So briefly, a few initiatives. On renewable energy, I think you have a good idea excuse me, of the challenges of Camp Pendleton. I'd like to talk about just one of our ongoing initiatives is to modernize the energy grid and include more renewables. On days with favorable weather conditions, sun, solar panels on base can generate about 50% of our energy needs. We have real estate that's zoned for solar panels that could generate up to 15 additional megawatts of renewable energy. We're working in partnership with California Energy Commission to put into place our first energy storage units by 2022. And this energy source could help support local first responders in the event of an emergency that might knock out the traditional power grid. So transitioning Marines, and this is a very important part of what we do at the battalion and across Camp Pendleton. The support services that we see for Marines that have completed their 4 years or 20 years are very, very impressive and have really matured over the years. Even for myself, perspective, coming back to Camp Pendleton, and as I look at heading out the door in a few years myself and transitioning, what we do for the Marines as they get ready to depart. And again, it's not a focus on the Marines who are retiring, because if you look at the number of Marines that are leaving, the majority are going to be those that do 4 years. Because of the Marine Corps, with 186,000 Marines, we have a quarter of those roughly turning over every year. So we have a lot of Marines that are transitioning out, a lot leaving from Camp Pendleton. What we do for transition readiness services, educational programs on the way out the door is very impressive. And it's not just a few hours in a classroom, say, hey, here are your opportunities as you get ready to rejoin the civilian workforce. It's more comprehensive than that. A few of the programs that we're especially proud of are partnerships with Microsoft, Airstreams Renewable to do the wind towers, and also BMW. So we actually have a partnership with BMW with a workshop on base where the Marines can take a multi-week course and get certified as mechanics for BMW and transition out. Again, small numbers for those, but overall, what we do to set the Marines up for success is very significant. And the emphasis on that is, I think, genuine across the board for Camp Pendleton. Because when we go back and you look at what we do as Marines, our three primary objectives: we make Marines, we win battles, and we return Marines back to civilian society better than when they came. So this is something from the base side I am extremely proud of how we help Marines that are transitioning back. So for security and disaster response, with 21 miles of coastline and 125,000 acres of land, monitoring and responding to security threats is a significant undertaking. So we've been working and exploring the integration of unmanned aerial systems into the base's existing safety and security infrastructure. In November of last year, the Marine Corps tested a new innovative system, offshore security system. The Lattice system uses a network of sensors to detect unknown objects offshore. From there, operators can launch a drone to track the objects and send live video feed back. This has a potential to increase security along the Camp Pendleton coast. And earlier this year, the base launched an unmanned system integrated to provide a proof of concept called Operation Wild Buck. Focus of the operation was to track deer aboard the base, but the same lessons learned could be used to search for and track Marines or hikers, as well as provide valuable assessments during natural disasters. Okay, conclusion of slides, but not conclusion of dialogue, I hope. So you've kind of gotten the fire hose effect here on Camp Pendleton and the Marine Corps overall. So I'm not sure how much of it pertained or answered what you're looking for, but I hope everyone came through with kind of an understanding of the importance and scope and scale of what we do at Camp Pendleton, because it's incredibly diverse, from the operational mission, from the installation, the supporting piece where we're looking at taking care of families, the training we provide for the Marines and sailors for whatever it is, to continue preparations for deployment, getting the Marines of Marine Expeditionary Force ready to deploy, for Marines of the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, or any of the components of the MAGTAF, of the Marine Air Ground Task Force, for them to be able to train and prepare for whatever is next. So I think the bottom line is, Camp Pendleton hasn't failed in its mission to provide support for the Marines and sailors in our country for the last 76 years, and that's what we're looking at for the future. So what I'd like to do is for Miss Fay and Captain Weaver can be our phone a friend lifeline in the back. Okay.
I'll look at you to stand right here.
Okay, perfect.
Great. Thank you so much, Captain Antakaya. Colonel Antakaya, excuse me.
Yeah.
Wow, where'd that come out of? All right. We have any questions? I see a question over here. We got mics coming around. I see a hand there. I see a hand over here. You can stand up on the stage.
Absolutely.
That'd be great. You want to stand up there as well? Can you feel a question?
Two short questions. One is, can these historical areas on the base be visited?
Yeah, sorry, your question was, can the historical locations on base be visited?
She talked about the historical areas. Could they be visited by civilians?
Yes.
How do you get
You can visit Camp Pendleton. It requires reservations.
I see.
It depends on who you are.
Okay.
If you're honestly, if you are a retiree or active duty, it's easy to get you aboard base. If, say, you belong to a church group that wants to come aboard base as a group, it's easiest if you are yourself a veteran, in other words, you have retired out of the military service, to host a group. We can let you all on because you are escorting your group on that bus, and that's easy to get you on. If it's 1 and 2 cars at a time, that's a little harder. We need to get your call and your reservation and process you through the front gate.
Thank you. My other question was, what is the living condition for the enlisted Marines on the base? Are they in big barracks, or is it, now that we have an an all-volunteer, is it the same as it was, in the 50s where you were in a barracks with 100 other guys?
Yeah, yes, sir. Great question. So a question on what the living conditions are for the Marines right now. So Marine Corps military, DOD, has come a long way on the quality of life for junior Marines. So when you go through recruit training, still the same. You'll be in an open squad bay. It'll be a platoon in one large room with bunk racks. So that's your traditional, what you think of as the military. But once you're done with that, and once you've completed the training, you'll be assigned as a single Marine to a barracks. The barracks right now are set up with quite nice. So think college dormitory with two Marines in one room with their own head or bathroom with a shower. So that's 2 Marines, and with as far as internet capability. So think kind of college dorms. They'll be roomed with a Marine of similar rank, preferably someone in the same work section, so you have unit integrity. They'll have opportunities to clean their room once a week and go through inspections. But it's come a long way from what we had before, where it was you just had a common bunk with 40 of your best friends in an open. So.
All right, over here.
Yeah, thank you very much for an informative presentation from you all. Question, I believe you said that the total Corps turnover was 25% per year? Then that leads to the question, for new recruits, what ballpark percentage stay to make it a career?
Perfect, sir. Yeah, great question. I don't quote me directly. I'll kind of talk in rough numbers. So Marine Corps, 186,000 right now. We have roughly 36,000 Marines come in every year, new Marines. So how many make it a career? Kind of doing the math, we can break this out, but majority, 3/4 of the Marines who come in for 4 years get out at 4 years. So 1/4 of our Marines transition past being a entry-level 4-year Marine to become what we call a careerist. So anyone who reenlists once, so if you do 4 years, you reenlist for another 4 years, we put you into we think of you as a career Marine now. And so the thought is if you reenlist once, most likely you'll continue on towards 20 years. So I guess bottom line, 1/4 of the Marines that come in will stick around for longer than 4 years. roughly.
That's great. Thank you. Right on here.
Yes, given articles recently in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, which indicate that up to 25% of the American labor force in the next decade or two will be robotized. They'll be out of a job. Do you see something similar happening to the Marine Corps, where Marines are going to be replaced by robots and new technology?
Sir, great question. I would think no. I think we will leverage that technology, maybe kind of defer to the others as well. So take advantage of the technology that's out there, whether it's the Marines that work in the explosive ordnance disposal and they're able to use robots to do some of the work that was previously done. But overall, you still need the numbers that we have for the Marine Corps. I think different areas as far as cyber and how we leverage artificial intelligence and all of that, how we use the unmanned aerial vehicles, that will change. But as far as numbers, the Marine Corps is saying, well, we're at 186,000 right now. We anticipated we can shrink down by so much because of technology. I don't see that happening, and I've not heard of any discussions like that. So.
We have time for a couple more questions up here in the back.
Many of us remember the El Toro Air Force Base that was here for many years and has been gone for like 25 years. Has all of that activity been incorporated into Camp Pendleton now?
Ma'am, I'll probably maybe defer to Faye on that, but between Marine Corps Air Station El Toro and Marine Corps Air Station Tustin, then that didn't go necessarily all, part of it went to Camp Pendleton, but it was also to Marine Corps Air Station Miramar. So we appreciate the Navy vacating Naval Air Station Miramar and the Marines coming in. So the larger presence for 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, the air element, is at Miramar. So is that
all right? And right up here.
You talking about that you are environmental stewards of the land, and then you talked about a lot of the properties leased off, such as to the state park system. My question is in relation to I went to the 241 toll road hearings when they had the Coastal Commission, and then later the Department of Commerce hearings over that development of the toll road coming all the way down to the coast. And the question is, what is the status of the leasing land when the lease runs out, such as for the state park, and the issue of the 241 toll road that runs into the San Onofre area?
It's a great question. I'll have to phone a friend on that one for...
I'll jump in here. So, sir, in regards to those sorts of issues, negotiations are ongoing with our partners, but at the end of the day, if agreements aren't reached, the legislature has the final decision on what happens with the land on Camp Pendleton. So I don't have an update for you, sir, other than to say discussions are ongoing at a higher level, but I don't have any more information for you right now, sir.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more question right over here.
I've got a quick question. This is we heard a lot during the presentation. 17 miles of coastline for Marine Corps Camp Pendleton, and I'm also very pleased with the concern for the environment. When I was on board that base 20 years ago, there was a lot of restriction in the use of that coastline. I can't remember, but at one time I thought that 17 miles was really only like 5 miles that could be used. Is that still current?
Sir, I can't completely speak to that as far as if it's contiguous or if it's kind of broken up. So maybe not the entire portion can be used, but whether it's down Del Mar, we can use portions, and then as we move north towards Las Pulgas. So I don't know if anything has changed from that aspect from when you were there. We probably come back and circle around you with more specifics on it. But I think the challenge is that even if the whole part is not, it's kind of spread out. So it's not, one area that, you could shrink that available coastline. I don't know.
Again, sir, yes, sir, there are a whole bunch of limitations as far as geography, what's useful for training and what's not depending on exactly what sort of training you want to do. I'm not an expert. We'd have to probably get somebody from our range operations division to give you the exact details on that. But if you want to, give me your contact information for further questions, and I can see if I can address that.
Thanks, Cam.
Well, and let's give us another hand for our Marines. Thank you so much for your presentation. We enjoyed it very much. If you have any questions, they'll be waiting up here at the front. If you want to ask personal questions, there's also information on the back tables. Thank you so much again for coming. We look forward to you coming back next week, and we'll see you at 9:30 next Friday. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.